David had owned the property for years, and the wetlands behind his home were legally protected. Then one morning, he discovered the HOA had plans that could completely change the land. At the HOA meeting, Karen proudly announced a new luxury tennis court for the neighborhood. But when David saw the proposed location, he immediately recognized the problem. David explained that the proposed court would overlap the protected wetland area. Karen dismissed his concerns and insisted the HOA had already approved the project. A few days later, heavy construction equipment arrived. David watched as the project moved toward the very wetland he had warned them about. The excavator began disturbing the ground near the wetland. David knew the project had crossed from planning into actual environmental damage. Within days, part of the natural wetland had been cleared and filled. David realized this was no longer just an argument with the HOA. It was a serious environmental issue. David carefully documented the project from his property. He photographed the changing landscape and organized his surveys, permits, and environmental records. David presented the documents again at the next HOA meeting. Karen still defended the project, but several homeowners began questioning the decision. David decided to report the environmental concerns through the proper official channels. He submitted the documentation and waited for the authorities to review the evidence. Soon, an environmental inspector arrived to examine the site. For the first time, the HOA board realized the project was being reviewed by someone outside the community. The inspector compared the existing landscape with the property and environmental records. Every measurement made the HOA's tennis court project look more complicated. The boundary markers matched the documents David had submitted. The proposed tennis court was clearly sitting dangerously close to the protected area. Karen's confidence began disappearing as the inspection continued. The board members quietly realized the project might have serious consequences. The construction was halted while the environmental review continued. The once confident HOA suddenly had an unfinished court sitting beside a damaged wetland. The evidence was carefully reviewed, including the original maps and photographs of the construction. David simply answered questions and let the documentation speak for itself. The HOA finally received the findings from the environmental review. The board learned that restoring the affected area would be required. The financial consequences were enormous, with restoration and penalties reaching approximately $500,000. Karen finally understood how expensive the decision had become. The next step was not simply paying money. It was restoring the damaged environment. A detailed restoration plan was prepared for the site. The unfinished tennis court had to be removed from the affected area. What the HOA had proudly announced as an improvement now had to be carefully dismantled. Layer by layer, the newly installed surface was removed. The restoration team worked carefully to minimize further disturbance to the surrounding wetland. As the damaged surface disappeared, natural water began moving to the area again. David could finally see signs that the wetland was recovering. Karen now had explained the failed project to the entire neighborhood. The homeowners wanted to know how such a costly mistake had happened. David showed the original map that had identified the wetland from the beginning. The information had been there all along. The homeowners finally understood that the wetland was more than an empty patch of land. It was an important part of the community's natural drainage and environment. Months later, the restoration work was beginning to show real progress. The wetland looked increasingly like the natural landscape David had known before construction. The final inspection showed how much work had gone into restoring the site. David watched quietly as the inspector documented the completed restoration. Karen had wanted a bigger amenity for the neighborhood. Instead, the project became a $500,000 lesson in why protected land must be respected. David never wanted a fight with the HOA. He simply wanted protected land to remain protected. And in the end, the evidence proved him right. One HOA decision had turned a community improvement project into a massive environmental and financial lesson. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from.